The Torah portion of Mishpatim begins with the law of a Hebrew slave who is sold because he was a thief. What an anticlimax. I mean, we've just read about the Sinaitic revelation in the previous Torah portion at the end of Parshat Yisro. We just read how God spoke to mankind. How the Jewish people were so shocked that their souls departed from their bodies. How their eyes had an audio experience and their ears had a visual experience. And we just read about the greatest epiphany that mankind has ever had, and now we suddenly turn to the law of a slave who was a thief and he got caught. I mean, what an anticlimax. But there's a profound message here. That all epiphanies, all spiritual elevated experiences will soon dissipate. They will soon evaporate if you don't engage them into something tangible. When you've had an inspiring synagogue service, when you've had an inspiring meditation, when you've had any sort of uplifting experience that's brought you closer to God and closer to your inner spirit, immediately, there and then, you have to say, okay, what am I going to do about this? Before it wears off, before the spirit evaporates, you have to make concrete decisions, resolutions, because it won't be there for long. And also, if you're recently become observant, you were inspired to become more religious, that inspiration doesn't last forever. Eventually it's going to wear off. Eventually you're going to feel that, why am I doing this? It's so repetitive. What was the point? What got me so excited? So when you have that inspiration, it's crucial that you put it into some sort of practical, real, tangible, concrete resolution so that it doesn't evaporate. That is the lesson from the beginning of our Torah portion about the thief who got caught. Chapter 21, verse 24, we read the famous line, an eye for an eye. Now, of course, according to the Talmudic tradition, this doesn't mean that, God forbid, you can gouge at someone's eye if your eye gets hurt. It's speaking about financial compensation. You have to compensate the value of an eye for a damaged eye. But this begs the question, why does the Torah mislead us? Why didn't the Torah just say, pay the value of an eye for an eye? Why does it seem to imply some sort of vicious revenge, and then we require the oral law to explain us, no, that's not the case, it's actually talking about financial compensation. So Rabbi Menachem Recanati, Italian Kabbalist, explained that, of course, from a Kabbalistic perspective, we always see the Torah speaking on the spiritual plane and hinting to the physical. The law that compensation is what is being spoken of here is only hinted to. What is literally being told us is that there is an eye for an eye. The human eye is in the image of God's eye. The human hand is in the image of God's hand. The human being was created in the image of God. And that's a real statement. According to Maimonidean philosophy, that would just be metaphorical. Of course, God has no human characteristics. But according to the Kabbalah, God emanated 10 faculties, 10 sefirot, 10 emanations, which are real, they are substantive, they have a certain shape and form, even though they are godly, but they don't imply any multiplicity in him, because of course his essence is above these 10 emanations. So therefore, when we say God has a right hand, and we have a right hand, he really does. His right hand is the Sephirah of Chesed. It's the emanation of Chesed. Not a physical hand, not even a spiritual hand. It's a godly emanation. But your right hand, and when you do kindness, is a reflection of that divinity. And there is divinity within you. So there's according to the Kabbalah, there's a very close, intimate connection between the human and the divine. And that's why the Torah says, an eye for an eye. There is more similarity to your eye and God's eye than you think. Chapter 21, verse 37, we have the laws of theft. Why are the laws of theft given here? So Rabbi Isaac Lurie explained that this was actually a tikkun, a spiritual healing for the generation of the flood. Of course, all the spiritual healing of the pre-Torah era was achieved in the Egyptian exile, but a little stain, a little blemish of healing, of sin, of damage remained, and this required healing through further laws. So therefore, here the laws of theft are a tikkun, a spiritual healing for the generation of the flood, whose main sin, the Talmud tells us, was this unrestrained theft. Chapter 23, verse 19, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. This is the famous prohibition of eating milk and meat. Now, this law stands out very much in this week's Torah portion because this Torah portion is filled with Mishpatim, with civil law, with criminal law. We don't have a lot of representation of chukim, which are supra-rational laws, laws which really don't make much sense at all, and if the Torah wasn't given, we would never have introduced the law of milk and meat. But of course, theft we would have, of course, introduced without the Torah, and many of the other laws regulating society. So why, after reading all these rational laws, all these logical laws, do we pop up and say, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, which is largely super-rational, though there are reasons given for it, but it's largely something which defies the intellect. So this, Lubavitcher Rebbe teaches, is actually a lesson against spiritual narcissism. Now some people, when you hear the word spirituality, some people say, oh, that's just self-indulgent, people are just being narcissistic, they just love themselves and they want to give themselves a high. There is always a danger with any spiritual system that we are going to get too comfortable and too uplifted. Rational laws make sense, they make us feel good, they make us feel righteous, and we connect with them. And therefore, if the Torah was purely rational, we would end up narcissistic. We would end up self-righteous because everything is just too... It would make us feel like goody-goodies. There has to be some element of the transcendent. There has to be some reminder that God is above all the facets of this world. God is above logic. He's above rationality. And therefore, after all the rational laws, we come with a reminder, don't eat milk and meat. The rational layer of the Torah is only skin deep. Below that is pulsating a transcendent energy, a super-rational energy which we cannot access with our minds, and we access purely with our devotion and our spirit. Chapter 24, verse 17, God is described as a consuming fire. Now obviously it's a principle of faith that God neither has a body or any image of a body. God is not physical, and this is purely metaphorical. But why was this metaphor chosen? What is the meaning, what is the message behind describing God as a consuming fire? So there's a beautiful message here, that God can only enter a humble heart. He can only enter a surrendered spirit. The biggest obstacle between you and God is arrogance, it's narcissism. It's the feeling that I'm here and I'm independent. It's that purely autonomous spirit. Although, of course, we need some sort of autonomy in order to do anything in life. But if our shell is too hard, God cannot come in. And that is why he's described as a consuming fire. God can burn straw, he can burn wood, he can burn paper, but he cannot burn stone. If your ego is rock hard like a stone, that consuming fire of God will not enter. You have to have some pliability, some malleability, some softness in you in order for the light of God to enter your heart and enter your life. Spiritual message for the week. Well, the first word of this week's Torah portion is and these are the laws. And the Talmudic rabbis pointed out that this word and is very important because it forms an interface between the previous great revelation of God, which overwhelmed the senses, and these rational laws which satisfy the senses and satisfy moral reason. Now, why is that word and so important? Because we tend to compartmentalize. We like to have rational life and any sort of spiritual, super-rational life as separate things. It's very hard to build bridges between the two. But the Torah puts the word and there to teach us that there shouldn't be that cognitive dissonance in our life. There should be bridges between the life of the spirit, the life of the transcendent, and the life of the real and the tangible. And that's what really the Torah is about. I think that word and sums up the whole Torah. Bring the transcendent, bring the spiritual, but make it with your life. It should be the spiritual and the physical. Thank you so much for joining us, and please again next week, Torah and Tan.